Chapter 9. The ecological problem in the light of Sufism. The conquest of nature and the teachings of Oriental science. According to the predominant tendency in Christian theology, the existence of other religions and the presence of nature constitute two related problems, insofar as they concern realities excluded from the grace of Christian revelation. It is no coincidence that Karl Barth and his followers firmly oppose, or at least ignore, both the theology of comparative religions and the theology of nature. Anyone who wishes to broaden the horizon of man by also embracing other forms of revelation should likewise include nature, since, from a metaphysical point of view, nature is a revelation of God that possesses its own message and its own spiritual methods. It is rather strange that modern man has been confronted with both problems simultaneously. He finds himself in desperate need of achieving a new vision of nature and of his relationship with it, in order to ensure his survival, at least physically. Likewise, he needs to reach a deeper understanding of other religions, in order to better understand himself, as well as to acquire a broader knowledge of the rest of humanity. In Islam, the key required to resolve both problems must be sought in Sufism. In the preceding chapter we set out to apply the teachings of Sufism to the solution of the problem posed to Islam by the presence of other religions. In the present essay, the same teachings must be applied to the question of the conquest of nature, which has acquired an extremely urgent character in the West and also in Japan, but which has so far failed even to attract the attention of most of the Islamic intelligentsia, despite the fact that for Islam this problem is also destined to become, in the near future, a matter of crucial importance. Examining this problem, it seems advantageous to us to consider Western sciences in general and not only Islamic science. We believe, in fact, that both coincide profoundly on the question of the relationship between man and nature. Superscript 3. All the more so since this problem and the crisis it has generated in this field through modern civilization have had worldwide repercussions. It is interesting to observe how the outcry of those who, a generation ago, were only a few voices, crying in the wilderness, has today become the battle cry of many men sufficiently lucid to perceive the disastrous effects that continuing along the path followed by Western civilization over the last 4 or 5 centuries in its exploitation of nature may have for all humanity. If in the past only a few solitary voices pointed out the dangers that indiscriminate material expansion and so-called development and progress would bring, today many understand that the goal of the conquest of nature, which once appeared to be the most evident aim of modern civilization, can no longer be pursued. Precisely man's success in the conquest of nature has become a grave danger. All the problems caused by the one-sided attitude of modern man toward nature, ranging from overpopulation and massive pollution to the decline in the very quality of human life and even the threat of its destruction, have led at least reflective minds to pause and re-examine the assumptions on which modern science and its applications are based. It seems that, in one way or another, the application of a science that claims to be an objective knowledge of nature, free from all spiritual and metaphysical considerations, has failed. The application of such a science appears to lead only to the destruction of its own object. Nature seems to accuse modern Western science of having used technique to extract its secrets and then applied that knowledge against it through technology, thereby neglecting an entire aspect of its reality, without which it could not continue to exist as the complete, harmonious, and integrated whole that it truly is. Considering the seriousness of the situation, we will dwell on this crucial problem, on the limitations of Western science and its countless applications to the conquest of nature, drawing inspiration from the sapiential teachings of Eastern traditions, which we shall here call Eastern science. First of all, we must clarify what we mean by Eastern science. By this expression we refer here to the science of the great Asian traditions, especially Chinese and Japanese, Indian, and Islamic. The term could also be extended to other traditional sciences, but for the moment it is sufficient to limit ourselves to the cases mentioned. Although these sciences are far from identical, they share the fundamental principle of considering the sciences of nature in the light of metaphysical principles or, from another perspective, of studying nature as a domain, contained and encompassed, by an immensely vaster suprasensible world. Because of this basic principle and other features directly or indirectly related to it, it is legitimate to speak of an Eastern science as a body of knowledge inspired by a worldview opposed to that of Western science as it has developed since the Renaissance and spread across other continents in our century. Moreover, in this essay the term science is deliberately preferred to others such as philosophy or religion, precisely because the present discussion concerns a science of nature which is akin, in subject matter though not in method or conception, to science, in the usual Western sense of the term. For several decades, a contrast has been drawn between Eastern spirituality, manifested in forms such as Sufism and Vedanta, on the one hand, and Western science on the other. It has been written that each has, in its own way, produced positive results and borne fruit. Modern Orientalists have more than once asserted that the East must learn science from the West, and that the West has no need to learn geology or botany from the East, although, as some Westerners have graciously admitted, it may benefit from knowledge of Eastern religiosity and spirituality. We may be the first to acknowledge that the West needs to learn metaphysics and traditional sapiential doctrines from the East if it is to preserve and revive something of its spiritual heritage. This is a reality of blinding obviousness, which any serious study of comparative religion or simply of contemporary Western mentality could reveal. Many have, precisely with this aim, traveled to Eastern countries that still preserve their spiritual heritage intact, such as Japan, India, and the Islamic world. However, very few people realize that even in the field of natural sciences the East has something extremely valuable to offer the modern world. To cite a few examples, Islamic natural philosophy and physics, Indian alchemy, Chinese and Japanese medicine, and even, I would venture to add, geomancy, the practice known as feng shui still widespread in China, all have something important to say about the ecological crisis caused by the application of modern science, a crisis that currently inspires universal concern. Eastern sciences, which the few historians of science specialized in these fields ought to make more accessible and better known, succeeded precisely in what, in modern eyes, appears as failure. Modern science, by contrast, is facing failure, especially due to its alliance with technology and with the spirit of the conquest of nature, precisely because of its success. In this supreme dilemma, the modern world needs not only Eastern spirituality and metaphysics, which are clearly the essence and foundation of all Eastern traditions and contain the principles of all traditional sciences, but also the healing influence of the worldview implicit in Eastern sciences of nature. So far, the educated reader has considered the worldview cultivated by Eastern sciences practically unacceptable, and this is still the case in most Western intellectual environments. Western science has progressed, whatever meaning one may attach to this ambiguous term, by denying the possibility of the existence of other sciences of nature. Its monolithic and monopolistic character has formed an essential part of its self-image, despite the fact that no logic can deny the possibility that multiple legitimate forms of science may exist simultaneously. The pride that has accompanied this particular mental activity called modern science has been so strong that it has relegated everything that does not conform to its conception of true science to the realm of pseudoscience. For this reason, many of the things rejected by official Western science inevitably return under the guise of occult sciences, against which modern science proves powerless. The totalitarian character of modern science has led the vast majority of humanity, which accepts its assumptions unconditionally, to deny the possibility that other serious forms of knowledge exist. Thus, interest in anything other than official science appears in the form of a shapeless and mutilated occultism. To quote one of the rare Western thinkers who truly understand the meaning of Eastern traditions and their sciences, man has allowed himself to be deceived by discoveries and inventions of a falsely totalitarian science, a science that does not recognize its limits and, for that very reason, lets slip everything that lies beyond them. The terms science and pseudoscience deserve closer examination. A traditional science such as that of metals and minerals, alchemy, or sacred geography, or geomancy, is called pseudoscience in modern language, without anyone taking the trouble to examine the principles upon which it is based. For example, it is undeniable that, by applying what is today called engineering or scientific architecture, modern man frequently produces aesthetic monstrosities, whereas by applying the so-called pseudosciences of sacred geography and geomancy, the Chinese, the Japanese, as well as the Persians and Arabs, produced some of the most beautiful buildings, gardens, and urban landscapes in history. The same could be said of the respective applications of chemistry and alchemy. In the face of the results of these two different types of science, one honored with the title of true science, and the other denigrated under that of pseudoscience, one instinctively perceives that there exists an aspect of nature which the so-called pseudosciences, as they existed in traditional civilizations and not in their Western distortions, take into account, while official modern science has allowed it to be ignored. This is the qualitative and spiritual element of nature, the source of the beauty reflected in the Persian or Japanese garden and in other similar works founded upon Eastern sciences. This is precisely the element that is lacking in modern science and which is certainly present in nature itself, while it is equally absent from the products of modern technology. It may therefore be concluded that the qualitative element, reflected in the beauty and harmony observable in the realm of nature, constitutes an ontological aspect of nature that no science can safely ignore. With the presence of this complex element, linked to the continuity of the human community, must be identified the source of strength and survival of that same community, even from a biological point of view. On the contrary, due to the absence of this qualitative and spiritual element, the complexity of technology belongs to a radically different order, and thus becomes increasingly a source of danger and a cause of weakening of technological society itself. Those who speak of a fusion between Eastern and Western sciences must understand that such an event has not yet taken place. Such a fusion could only be concretely realized if modern science were to abandon its monopolistic conception, allowing the development of a science capable of embracing both the qualitative and spiritual elements of nature and the quantitative aspect of things. Such a science would necessarily have to be based on a metaphysical and cosmological doctrine conscious of the relativity of the relative and, at the same time, aware that the entire plane of material reality is nothing more than a speck of dust in comparison with the suprasensible and superformal world that surrounds it. Such a science would also necessarily have to be joined to an attitude of contemplation of nature, rather than to the desire to dominate and conquer it. That desire is certainly the direct result of the fact that modern man, although immersed in scientific study of reality, remains completely ignorant of some fundamental aspects of that same reality. The contribution of Eastern science to the solution of contemporary problems posed by the application of Western science in many fields can be better understood if one bears in mind that the former is based on the unity and interrelation inherent in things. This simple principle, which constitutes the essence of all Sufi doctrine, can also illuminate the very nature of Eastern science, whose contents we cannot even outline here. Modern science has achieved positive results precisely because it has neglected the interrelation between the various components of nature, isolating each segment in order to analyze it separately. According to Newtonian physics, when a falling body is studied, the gravitational forces acting upon it could ideally be calculated only if the mass and distance of every particle of matter in the universe were known. But since this is impossible, we consider only the Earth as the center of attraction and ignore everything else. As a result, we are able to obtain an exact numerical value by applying Newton's laws to the simplified case just described. There is no doubt that something has been gained through this method, but something far more fundamental has also been lost and neglected, the basic truth that the simple falling body is connected with all other particles of the universe by that force which Plato would have called eros and Avicenna ishq, love. Until now, the loss of this aspect of interrelation between things was considered insignificant compared with the advantage of mathematical precision. But now that the application of this partial science of nature has destroyed much of nature itself and threatens us with even greater calamities, especially since ecologists have discovered that the entire natural environment constitutes an integrated, extraordinarily complex but harmonious whole in which nothing functions in isolation, it has become evident how catastrophic this omission has been. Only now, after having caused such enormous damage, do we realize the need to stop the indiscriminate destruction of our environment and to put an end to the waste of resources that sustain our needs. We must understand that our needs and the source that satisfies them are connected with the other parts of nature, both animate and inanimate, a connection that the present natural sciences have failed to grasp due to the limitations they have imposed upon themselves. In the West, a poet such as John Donne was able to write, 4 centuries ago, in his religious poems. No man is an island, entire of itself, every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less. Although Donne was referring here to humanity, his vision certainly did not exclude the whole of creation of which man is a part. Later, a romantic poet such as Wordsworth was able to describe the awareness of the spirit infused in all forms of nature, by which those forms are integrated, an awareness that leads man to a sense of the infinite, as shown in these verses. A sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean and the living air, and the blue sky, and in the mind of man, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. Such conceptions were regarded by official Western science as mere poetic imagery, with no relation to science. The same criterion was applied to the work of other Romantic poets, such as Shelley and Novalis, who wrote about the spiritual aspect of nature and the interrelation of its parts. Only now are ecologists beginning to realize how scientific those poetic expressions actually were. But then, as now, in the absence among scientists of adequate metaphysical knowledge and a living sapiential tradition that could provide an intellectual foundation for such poetry, the conceptions expressed by Donne, Wordsworth, and others lacked a solid intellectual basis. Consequently, they cannot help us transform Western science in a sufficiently radical way so that it may seriously take into account this sense of interrelation between things, including the different levels of existence. It is to Eastern science that we must turn in order to discover a worldview in which the principle of correlation between things plays an essential role. Traditional science of nature exists precisely for the purpose of revealing, not concealing, the unity of nature, derived from the unity of the divine principle, as all masters of Islamic gnosis have affirmed. In the case of Islamic sciences, the sense of unity permeates all things and all forms of knowledge, since unity, al-tawhid, constitutes the central axis around which, according to the Islamic conception, everything that exists revolves. Also in Hinduism, the various traditional sciences contained in the darshanas, although outwardly separate, are founded upon the interrelation of all things and represent different degrees in the unfolding of knowledge. As for the Chinese and Japanese traditions, the 10,000 things are likewise interconnected and belong in reality to a single totality. Therefore, every science of nature reflects in different ways both heaven and earth and, through them, the unity that transcends all polarity. An ancient Chinese sage, Xing Chao, once said, "Sky, earth, and I myself arise from the same root. The 10,000 things and I are of one substance." The intuition of the unity of the roots of things, a reflection of the metaphysical principle of the transcendent unity of being, constitutes the true matrix of Eastern sciences of nature. Among traditional civilizations and their sciences, Islam occupies a special position, performing the function of intermediary between the Eastern traditions and the West. Just as Islam geographically covers the central belt of the world, it also occupies an intermediate position between the intellectual climate of the West and the spiritual climate of India and the Far East. When the Quran calls the Islamic people the community of the Middle Way, it refers, among other things, to this truth. Islamic sciences, cultivated with passion for more than 7 centuries, from the 3rd or 9th century to the 10th or 16th century, and even beyond, are deeply linked, on the one hand, with Western science in its medieval and Renaissance phases, and, on the other, with the sciences of India and China. In fact, Islamic science maintained a historical relationship with those sciences both from the standpoint of its genesis and its later development. Islam created a science that must be recognized as such, whatever definition we adopt for the term, a science without which Western science could not have developed, even though it later adopted entirely different conceptions. At the same time, Islamic science did not lead to the birth of a secular science independent of a spiritual vision of the universe. It carefully preserved the proportion between things, assigning both the spiritual and the material aspects what was due to them, while always maintaining the hierarchy between being and knowing. In this way, the integration of the sciences of nature within a wisdom that transcends all discursive thought was preserved. Moreover, it must be borne in mind that many of the most important Islamic scientists were also Gnostics, Arif, Theosophers, and traditional philosophers, Hakim, who developed analytical sciences without ever departing from a contemplative vision of nature. Superscript 1 Superscript 1. From Avicenna to Nasir al-Din Tusi and Qutb al-Din Shirazi, all of them great scientists and mystical philosophers, we continually encounter eminent figures in the history of science who were also endowed with spiritual vision, and who would have felt perfectly at ease in the company of the contemplative sages of China, Japan, or India. In Islam, various speculative schools developed in a hierarchical order, encompassing a vast intellectual field that extends from Sufism, akin, in its doctrines and methods, to the pure sapiential doctrines of the Indian, Chinese, and Japanese traditions, to the peripatetic school, linked to the most important tradition of medieval scholastic Europe, from which modern rationalist philosophy emerged, albeit through a later misunderstanding. Likewise, thanks to the central position occupied in Islam by the doctrine of unity, the principle of the oneness of nature on which Eastern sciences are based is constantly and prominently emphasized in Islamic science, which is characterized by both rational and intuitive aspects. For this reason, to one trained in Western modes of thought, this science is perhaps more accessible than the purely metaphysical and suprarational doctrines that characterize the works of the sages of India and the Far East. However, this is merely a question of method, relating to doctrinal exposition and to the means of access to pure truth. As already noted, Eastern sciences are essentially unified in their conception of nature and in the principles of the science grounded upon it. Returning to the need to turn to Eastern science in order to help Western science resolve its own crisis, it must be recognized that the awareness achieved by modern ecologists, that is, the fact that the entire environment must be studied as a complex unity in which each element is related to the others, can only be completed if it also aspires to understand the psychological and spiritual plane of reality and, ultimately, the very origin of all that exists. Naturally, it is useful to be aware that inanimate objects are linked to living beings and that, in the physical world, all parts are interrelated, but the metaphysical principle of the mutual relationship between the various states of being, according to which each lower state derives its reality from the higher state that is inseparable from it, must be constantly kept in mind and can in no way be denied or eliminated. If the earth is today threatened by disorder and chaos, it is precisely because Western man has attempted for many centuries to remain a merely earthly being and has sought to exclude his earthly world from all transcendent reality. The desecration of nature through its so-called conquest and the development of a purely secular science of nature would not have been possible otherwise. If this is so, it is not possible to correct the disorder in the realm of nature without eliminating its cause, which is nothing other than the claim that the earthly state of existence is isolated from all that transcends it. Current ecological considerations may overcome some of the obstacles created by sectorial and specialized studies of nature, but they cannot solve the much deeper problems concerning man himself, since it is precisely man who has disturbed the ecological balance by introducing elements of a non-biological order. The spiritual rebellion of man against heaven has contaminated the earth, and no attempt to heal the earthly situation can truly succeed unless that revolt against heaven is brought to an end. Indeed, only the light of heaven, poured upon the earth through seers and contemplative spirits who live within the authentic religious traditions of humanity, maintains the harmony and beauty of nature and in fact preserves the cosmic balance. Unless this truth is understood, all attempts to restore peace with nature will fail, even if partial successes are achieved in preventing particular catastrophes. Once again, only Eastern science, founded upon metaphysical principles, can restore harmony between man and the earth, first establishing it between man and heaven and thereby transforming man's greedy and acquisitive attitude toward nature, which drives him to a ruthless exploitation of natural resources, into an attitude grounded in contemplation and respect. Only tradition can transform man from a plunderer of the earth into a vicegerent of God on earth, Khalifa Allah fi al-ard, to use the Islamic definition. If one were to ask what practical solutions should be adopted in the present situation, one might answer that, on the level of knowledge, it is necessary to seek a higher science of nature within which the current quantitative sciences of nature can be integrated. This could in turn be achieved through knowledge of the indispensable metaphysical principles upon which those sciences ultimately rest. On the level of action, this means, first of all, acting in every circumstance in accordance with truth, that is, in accordance with the religious principle. To the question, often posed in desperate terms, of whether action still retains any meaning, one may once again respond with the words of F. Schuon. An affirmation of truth, or any effort made for the sake of truth, is never in vain, even if it is not possible to assess its results in advance. Moreover, in this respect we have no choice. Once truth is known, we must necessarily live in it and struggle for it, but what we must avoid at all costs is allowing ourselves to be lulled by illusions. Although at this moment the horizon may appear darker than ever, we must not forget that, in a future perhaps inevitably distant, victory will be ours, and it cannot but be ours. Truth, by its very nature, overcomes all obstacles, vincit omnia veritas. As for nature, all those who understand Sufism or, more broadly, metaphysics and Eastern sciences of nature have the duty and responsibility, before truth, to continue to spread their knowledge, to love nature, and to contemplate its infinite forms as so many theophanies of the infinite divine possibility. Such action is in itself the greatest act of charity toward the world, for it would make concretely evident to modern man the possibility of a different attitude toward nature, an attitude he desperately needs in order even to survive physically. Those who come from cultures such as the Islamic one, in which Sufi poets, especially those writing in Persian, have for centuries sung the beauties of nature as reflections of the beauties of paradise, where man is renewed and regenerated, have in our time a special mission. The same may be said of the Japanese, whose extraordinary artistic qualities, combined with the deepest penetration into nature, have produced works that could be described as echoes of the angelic world in earthly forms. Indeed, Japanese artists have literally succeeded in bringing paradise to earth. All those who possess this gift of insight must remain faithful to themselves and preserve the traditional sciences of nature, as well as those metaphysical principles so valuable for the future of their cultures. They must also make these teachings known and spread them throughout the world among those who seek them in order to benefit from them. In this vital problem, as in so many others, the traditional cultures of the East can render the greatest service to the world by remaining, above all, and more than ever today, faithful to their own principles. In such a task, these cultures have the certainty of final success, because they are founded upon truth, as the Quran affirms. Truth has come and falsehood has vanished, surely falsehood is bound to vanish. Chapter 10. What can Islam offer the modern world? It has now become so habitual to label certain concepts as inadequate for the modern world that one tends to forget the essential reality of doctrines and concepts whose meaning is permanent, and at the same time, by neglecting the true needs of the modern world, one also fails to recognize how relevant such concepts are to those very needs. Everything that does not appear up to date, in this whirlpool of superficial change, is regarded as unimportant and irrelevant. Yet what is in fact insignificant and trivial is precisely that mental attitude which rejects and ignores perennial and permanent truths, which have always been meaningful for man because they address something permanent within him. A part of modern humanity no longer considers the perennial truths of religion and wisdom cultivated and followed by sages of all ages to be meaningful. This intellectual blindness is due above all to the fact that the very existence of that part of humanity has lost its meaning. Taking itself too seriously and taking too seriously its imperfect perception of things, what it calls the existential condition of modern man, this humanity is unable to turn the scalpel of criticism upon itself. Instead, it merely criticizes the objective and revealed truth contained in all orthodox and authentic religions, which in reality constitute the only possible criterion for judging the value and importance of man. The relevance of Islam, as of any authentic religion, for the modern world can be examined in light of the ontological priority of the former over the latter. Islam, that is, religion as such, springs from the absolutely real, since it is the message of heaven, whereas the world, as such, is always relative, and whether ancient or modern, it remains always the world, dunya, according to the traditional Islamic term, that which is below. The modern world is not so much the world itself as that world as it appears from a particular traditional religious perspective. In fact, it is more distant from the immutable and the permanent than any other world of which we have historical record, and for this very reason it has an even greater need for the message of the immutable. Islam is precisely that message. It is the direct call of the Absolute to man, inviting him to cease wandering in the labyrinth of the relative and to return to the Absolute, the One. It appeals to what is most permanent and unchanging in the human being. Therefore, this message belongs to all worlds and all generations, so long as man remains man. Today, even in Western academic circles, long dominated by 19th-century evolutionism, some scholars and scientists are beginning to rediscover and confirm the permanent nature of man and his needs. They turn their attention toward that permanent element to which the Islamic message is most directly addressed. Men are born, live, and die, and are always in search of the meaning of the alpha and omega of their lives, as well as of the interval between them. This search for meaning, as essential as the search for food and shelter, is in reality the search for ultimate reality, for the absolute, and it constitutes a permanent human need, as indispensable as bread. Religion provides precisely this meaning and constitutes, in a certain sense, a refuge amid the storm of multiplicity and indeterminacy manifested in the cosmos, as well as the uncertainties of temporal and earthly existence. It is no coincidence that some Muslim sages have regarded the Islamic prayers as a refuge, malja, in the storm of everyday life. The message of Islam is as perennial as the human need for spiritual refuge and for meaning in existence. From a more specific point of view, Islam offers a remedy for one of the characteristic illnesses of the modern world, widespread secularization, a process consisting in emptying all things of their spiritual meaning. In the West, the first sphere to be secularized was the temporal sphere linked to government and law, although in the Middle Ages, and in fact until relatively recent times, as long as traditional political institutions survived, even that sphere possessed a religious meaning. Later, thought itself was secularized in the form of philosophy and secular science. Then came art in all its manifestations, and finally religion itself succumbed to this tendency. The rebellion of the Renaissance initially made this process appear as a gradual movement toward the conquest of freedom. But now that this movement has led into a dangerously blind alley, many understand that the fruit of the Renaissance was simply the freedom to lose the only true freedom granted to man, the freedom of spiritual liberation. All other apparent freedoms are nothing but slavery, submission to external forces of nature or to inner passions. In the face of the disease of secularization and of negative freedom that now borders on anarchy, Islam presents a conception of life that is entirely sacred, and a freedom that begins with submission to the divine will and then opens onto the infinite. Indeed, in the languages of Islamic peoples there is no strict distinction between the sacred and the profane. There are no adequate terms to translate these concepts precisely. Through the divine law, the Sharia, which encompasses the entirety of human life, every human activity receives a transcendent dimension. Once made sacred, life acquires its true meaning. This implies, evidently, accepting the Sharia and putting it into practice, and it requires, from the point of view of human nature, a sacrifice, because nothing can be consecrated without sacrifice. The very literal meaning of the word sacrifice is precisely, to make sacred, sacrum facere. For a non-Muslim, it is always striking to observe the extent to which Islamic society has been able to apply the Sharia, and how, even in those regions where its influence has recently weakened, the forms of behavior it prescribes still persist in certain strata of Islamic society. At the center of the Sharia are the daily Muslim rites, salat in Arabic, namaz in Persian and Urdu, which are, according to prophetic tradition, the support and pillar of religion. Now, one of the most notable features of these acts of worship, which do not correspond to the individual prayers of other religions, for example Christianity, but rather resemble a rite such as the Mass, is the possibility of performing them anywhere and by any Muslim. The priestly function, which in certain religions is reserved for a particular class of men, is shared in Islam by all members of the community. Therefore, Muslim believers are offered the possibility of participating in the community of believers, the Ummah, even when they are not geographically part of it. In the present age, in which men travel widely and over great distances, and in which circumstances may hinder the practice of certain religious observances, Islam thus possesses the relative advantage of being able to be practiced anywhere. The fact that Islamic worship has a notable capacity for adaptation does not mean, of course, that the Muslim should conform to the modern world and to all the errors it implies. Islam, like every revealed truth, comes from God. Therefore, it is the world that must conform to this truth, not the other way around. Once this point is clarified, it can be said that whoever wishes to practice Islam can do so in whatever situation he finds himself, without encountering the external difficulties that hinder the practice of certain religions, especially those in which a very complex daily ritual constitutes an important part of religious life. The daily Islamic rites also have the great advantage of making man conscious that he carries his own center within himself. The great illness of modern man consists, in essence, in the loss of the center, something clearly manifested in the chaos of so-called modern literature and art. Islam offers a remedy for this illness. In general terms, prayer places man in the axial and vertical dimension that points toward the center. In a particular sense, Islamic rites make it possible to carry that center at all times. The fact that, in whatever point of the earth one may be, the daily prayers are oriented toward Mecca, the supreme center of Islam, clearly indicates this reflection of the center in every place and at every moment in which prayer is performed. By virtue of the power of these prayers, man remains continuously united to the center that coordinates and harmonizes his actions and his life. The fundamental Islamic doctrine of unity, al-Tawhid, emphasizes the need for integration. God is one, and therefore man, who has been created in his image, must be integrated and unified. The goal of religious and spiritual life, as already noted, must be the complete and total integration of man, both in depth and in extension. Modern man suffers from excessive fragmentation both in science and education and in social life. Indeed, precisely under the pressure of technology, social bonds and even human personality tend toward disintegration. The Islamic ideal of unity stands in firm opposition to this multiplicity and division. It reverses the centrifugal tendencies of man, which incline him increasingly to disperse his soul and energy toward the periphery, and returns the soul to the center. Today everyone invokes peace, but it is never attained because, from a metaphysical point of view, it is absurd to expect that a civilization that has forgotten God can grant itself peace. Peace among men is the result of peace with God and with nature. It is the fruit of balance and harmony, which can only be achieved through the integration made possible by Tawhid. Islam has been unjustly described as the religion of the sword and of war, when in reality it is a religion that seeks to bring peace through submission to the divine will, as indicated by the very term Islam, which in Arabic evokes both peace and submission. And this is possible by giving to each thing what is due to it. Islam maintains a remarkable balance between the needs of the body and those of the spirit, between this world and the world to come. There can be no peace in a civilization that has reduced human well-being to the satisfaction of animal needs and refuses to consider those human needs that transcend earthly existence. Moreover, by reducing man to a purely earthly creature, such a civilization is incapable of addressing his spiritual needs, which nevertheless continue to exist. In this way, a mixture has been created of crude materialism and an even more dangerous pseudo-spiritualism, whose opposition to the former is more apparent than real. Thus we find ourselves in a situation in which even earthly life itself risks being compromised, precisely the life that is today loved as an end in itself. One of the fundamental messages of Islam for the modern world consists in the importance of giving each thing what is due to it, of keeping each element at its proper level, and of preserving the correct proportion between things. The peace so greatly sought is only possible if the needs of man are taken into account not only as a rational animal, but above all as a being born for immortality. To concern oneself only with the physical needs of men is to reduce them to slavery and to create, even on the physical level, problems that are impossible to solve. It was not religion, but modern medicine, that created the problem of overpopulation. And yet, religion is now required to solve that problem, with the demand that it accept the partial forgetting of the sacred meaning of life itself. Similarly, peace among religions is today a matter of vital importance. Here too Islam has a message for modern man. As noted in previous chapters, Islam considers as an article of faith, iman, the acceptance within itself of the prophets who appeared earlier and strongly affirms the universality of revelation. There is no other sacred text that speaks so broadly and openly about the universality of religion as the Quran. Islam, the last of the religions of present humanity, is in this respect linked with Hinduism, the first and most primordial of existing religions, in its consideration of religion in its universal manifestation through the cycles of human history. As shown in Chapter 8, Islam truly has much to teach, in the field of metaphysics and comparative theology of religions, to those who wish to deepen this subject at a genuinely intellectual level, without limiting themselves to collecting historical and philological data. Finally, in addressing the theme of peace, it is necessary to say something about the inner peace that men today seek desperately, to the point of having encouraged in the West the establishment of countless pseudo-yogis and supposed spiritual healers. Human beings instinctively perceive the importance of meditation and contemplation, but unfortunately, very few are willing to submit themselves to the discipline of an authentic tradition, the only one capable of guaranteeing access to the joy that arises from the contemplation of heavenly realities. For this reason they turn to drugs, to self-realization centers, and to the thousand pseudo-Eastern teachers, a true revenge of the East upon the West for what the latter did to Eastern traditions during the colonial period. Islam possesses the necessary means for spiritual realization in the highest sense. Sufism is the privileged vehicle of these means. But since Sufism is the esoteric and inward dimension of Islam, it cannot be practiced outside it. Only Islam can guide those who possess the necessary inclination toward that inner place of joy and peace where the gardens of paradise are prefigured. Here too, a characteristic feature of the contemplative path of Islam, Sufism, is that it can be practiced anywhere and in any condition of life. Sufism is not based on an outward flight from the world, but on inner detachment from it, as a contemporary Sufi said. It is not I who have abandoned the world, it is the world that has abandoned me. Indeed, this inner detachment can coexist with an extremely active outer life. Sufism achieves the union between active life and contemplative life, in accordance with the unifying nature proper to Islam. The spiritual force of Islam creates in the external world, through its intense inner activity, an atmosphere that naturally attracts man toward meditation and contemplation, as can clearly be seen in the spirit of Islamic art. The external opposition between what belongs by definition to the world of activity is resolved in an inner peace that is characteristic of the one, of the center. Islam, like all other authentic religions, carries a message from eternity toward what is immutable and permanent in man. As such, it transcends temporality. It also possesses certain providentially bestowed characteristics that make it possible for man to follow it in every situation and in all worlds, benefiting from its teachings that if there were ever to exist a world for which religion in general and Islam in particular had completely lost their meaning, that world itself would have lost all meaning, it would become pure illusion. As long as some element of reality remains in the world, or in a given world, Islam will continue to offer a valid message for that world, a real message precisely because it comes from truth. For, as Islamic metaphysical doctrines teach, truth and reality are ultimately one and the same thing.